It's not the civilian side of the ministry or the defense ministry or the political side that doesn't want the report to be declassified.
When Major Shaitan Singh fell disabled by wounds in his arms and abdomen, his men tried to evacuate him, but they came under heavy machine gun fire. Major Shaitan Singh then ordered his men to leave him to his fate in order to save their lives.
Rezang is, of course, this very important battleground in Ladakh. And Ladakh was one of two key battlegrounds in the 1962 war. China never had a border.
Right.
When you don't have a border, you don't have conflicts. But what happened in 1950 is that China absorbed Tibet. The Chinese attacked in very large numbers. It was a brigade plus that attacked this small little defensive line of about 3 to 4 kilometers.
Hello and welcome to Inner Defense. This week we're going to talk about the 1962 war, a war that I feel not many people know about properly, and especially the Battle of Rezang, a battle that I think everybody should know about. But why? That's because a movie is releasing this weekend. In fact, I think by the time this podcast is out, the first shows would have been in theaters. The film is called 120 Bahadur. It stars Farhan Akhtar and shares a set of producers who worked on a film that I believe has so far been India's best war and military film, Lakshya. So in this context, we'll talk about this battle, what makes this battle so epic, and also about the 1962 war, a war that is often misunderstood, a war that I said earlier, people don't really understand properly. And who better for that than Sandeep Unnithan? Hey Sandeep, how are you?
Hey, good Dave. Good to be back.
Yeah.
War movies, my favorite topic.
War movies. So, like I said, my personal favorite in India is Laksh. But I have a feeling that, and based on my chats with other defense correspondents, defense journalists, and experts like you, yours would probably a film that I haven't seen, that my generation has not seen, the 1964 movie Hakikat, which, by the way, also is based on the Battle of Rezang.
Yes.
So, is that your favorite one?
It is. It's actually a close contest between Hakikat and Vijeta.
Achha.
Vijeta is a Shashi Kapoor made movie in Shyam Benegal directed it. Was it in 83? It was the 82, 83 is when it released. It's a toss between Hakikat and Vijeta, right? Two outstanding movies made by very passionate producers, directors. Chetan Anand made Hakikat just 2 years after the 1962 war. So, when we were coming to grips with what happened during the India-China war. And of course, Vijeta was more about celebrating the Indian Air Force. But Vijeta has a link to your favorite film, Laksh. Well, I believe Laksh is actually a remake of Vijeta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you see it, you figure out that it's actually a coming-of-age movie, right? Hrithik Roshan is this young kid who doesn't know what to do with life, and then he gets into the army, and he gets a certain sense of purpose, and then he becomes this, a combat-hardened soldier. Exactly the script of Vijeta.
Interesting.
Right? So, Shashi Kapoor's son, who's Kunal Kapoor, he's this, and incidentally, this is the first time that you had an actor, a lead actor, playing a Sikh in the lead role. Right. And, until then, it's very funny that you notice these little things that until then, Sikh characters only, sidees, and there would be character actors and all. But here, he grew his hair, he tied a turban, and he literally got into the part of this young Air Force officer who comes, he graduates, he becomes a war hero. Yeah. That's what Vijeta was. Very fine film, actually. But, they're better than anyone else. There are just, 10 war movies that we've made in the last, 80-odd years. There's so few to choose from. I mean, we haven't seen really gripping war movies, in a sense like, Saving Private Ryan or Thin Red Line or Stalingrad or whatever. Yeah. We have a lot of war history to talk about, right from not just the 20th century, but even before that. Yeah. But the kind of films that have come out, I was talking to Amir Raza Hussain, who made that great ballet on Kargil. He staged that big play. And he says, where are the war movies in India? They're all romantic movies with, war in the backdrop. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, right. And interesting that you mentioned war history, because that is actually something I wanted to begin this episode with. Is your thoughts on whether India is not very great at war history? And I think this is a topic that is gonna be very personal to you because you're somebody who loves reading about military history, right? That's something that you've told us previously, and military history has actually shaped the sort of career trajectory that you've taken within the broad umbrella of covering defense. Because the reason I say so is, when I tried to research about the 1962 war, especially, I could not really find a lot of material. One, the report that was commissioned by the then army chief, the Brooks Bhagat report, that remains classified till date.
Right.
Second, I was very surprised to know there was actually an official history commissioned by the Ministry of Defense. It was written by Colonel Anil Athale.
Yes.
But I could not find that history anywhere. It's not there on the Ministry of Defense website. There are references to it on some forums like Bharat Rakshat and stuff like that. But I really could not find a lot of info about this. I think perhaps the only conflict that has a full-fledged report document out in public domain is Kargil War, the Kargil Review Committee report. But apart from that, like I said, I think when it comes to war history, India is not very good. Do you share that sentiment?
Yeah, I think that's true to an extent. But, I want to correct you on the fact that there is actually a lot of writing, Dave, on the 1962 war. I mean, it's one of the most documented wars, in Indian history simply because China was involved, right? And we have writing as late as 5-6 years back when you have Bertil Littner's book, India's China War. I forget the name of the War on the Roof of the World. I forget the name of his book title, but he's written a book, international author writing a book, Neville Maxwell's book, of course. And there is reason to believe India's China War is one of those early books that came out, I think in 70, 71. Neville Maxwell is the Australian author, but he gives a very one-sided view of the war. He says his whole point has been that India triggered off China's border aggression, and we provoked them, and therefore they attacked and all. It's a very one-sided version, but it is a version that many believe is something that he wrote based on the Henderson-Brooks report. He had an early copy of the Henderson-Brooks report, and before he passed away, he died a few years back, he released the copy of the report that he had, thereby confirming our suspicions that all along that he knew what the Henderson-Brooks report was. And here's the funny thing that, when I came to Delhi many years back from Mumbai as a young defense journalist, I filed, RTI was new at that time, the right to information, and I filed an RTI. And I asked for a copy of the Henderson-Brooks report. Everybody does. It's a rite of passage. I want to get the declassified version of the Henderson-Brooks report. So the person who was handling, one of the officers was handling this petition, he called me to his office and he says, "You want the Henderson-Brooks report?" One sec. Just leaned down to his thing, pulled out a small book, India's China War, Neville Maxwell. That's the Henderson-Brooks report. That's
wow.
It. So that's how it was. I mean, this is someone who had seen the report. So the point that he was making is that it's not the civilian side of the ministry or the defense ministry or the political side that doesn't want the report to be declassified. He says it was the Indian military that did not want it to be declassified. So there are 2 copies of it that exist. The only 2 known copies we know is one is, of course, with the Defense Secretary, and the other one is with the Director General Military Operations, and both in South Block.
Interesting. Which is, I think, why this episode is going to be a rager, because I think you've read lots and bits and pieces of that. But, Sandeep, I want to start with the Battle of Rezang, because the movie is coming out and because I don't want this to be a border sort of a moment for me where I learn about this epic battle from a movie. I want to learn about it from someone like you who's read about it extensively. And also understand why is this battle considered to be so epic. What I have are some references which tells me that it is epic, but I'm not sure why. But I'll read it out for our listeners and viewers. One is the poem that is inscribed on the memorial that stands at the spot where this battle was waged. It's a poem by Thomas Babington Macaulay. It's from the Horatius at the Bridge. The first 4 lines of the stanza are: "How can a man die better than facing fearful odds? For the ashes of his father and temples of his gods.
Yeah.
Basically talking about selflessness, talking
Yes.
about the ultimate sacrifice
Yeah.
for your society's history, for your society in general, for your culture. And also, I will read out a couple of sentences from the Veer Chakra citation to the officer who was leading the 120 odd Ahi troops
Yeah.
at the Battle of Rezangla, Major Shaitan Singh. The last part of his citation says, so the citation also says, by the way, that during the battle, for every man that India lost, the
Yeah.
enemy, China, lost around 4 to 5. And for Shaitan Singh himself, the citation says, when Major Shaitan Singh fell disabled by wounds in his arms and abdomen, his men tried to evacuate him, but they came under heavy machine gun fire. Major Shaitan Singh then ordered his men to leave him to his fate in order to save their lives. Major Shaitan Singh's supreme courage, leadership, and exemplary devotion to duty inspired his company to fight almost to the last man.
Right.
And there are legends that later on, when expeditions were sent to that area to sort of recover the bodies of the fallen soldiers, the soldiers were found in firing positions.
Yeah.
Apparently, the guns were in their hand. They had, I think, Lee Enfield rifles.
Yes.
The rifles were in their hands, and their fingers were on the triggers, and that's how they had died. So this is what I have based on my my measly research. Take it from there, Sandeep, and
Right.
tell us about this battle.
So Rezangla is of course this very important battleground in Ladakh, and
Yeah.
Ladakh was one of two key battlegrounds in the 1962 war. And the war, as everyone knows, the background to this is that until 1950, India and China never had a border.
Right.
When you don't have a border, you don't have conflicts. But what happened in 1950 is that China absorbed Tibet, right? They militarily invaded and captured Tibet, conquered Tibet. And this is a province that, a nation that the British had always maintained as a buffer zone between India and the Chinese Empire,
Yeah.
right? They had two buffers, like I always say. There's one buffer is on the west, that's Afghanistan with the Russian Empire, and the other one was the buffer with the Chinese Empire, which is Tibet. Now, when Red China is Mao Zedong, who takes over China in 49, and 50 he starts expanding and he captures Tibet. 59 the Dalai Lama flees with 100,000 followers, and he comes into India, and India gives him shelter, and that doesn't go down well with the Chinese, and the tensions begin. And in 1962, Mao decides to strike at India, and this is again where Neville Maxwell goes completely wrong, where saying that we provoked them. So what does India do when the tensions are building up? Prime Minister Nehru at that time, he reasserts the McMahon line, our claim on the fact that this is India's boundaries as left by the British in 1947, which China doesn't recognize. And Mao Zedong at that time, you have to understand the background of what's going on in China at that time. 1959, Mao had launched the Great Leap Forward. It's one of the single most disastrous plans launched by any leader, which has killed the maximum number of people, right? Something like 30 to 40 million Chinese died because of this Great Leap Forward. Very quickly, for those of you watching this, the Great Leap Forward is that Mao wanted to make China an agricultural superpower and an industrial superpower at the same time. Yeah. And he got people into creating, foundries in their homes by collectivizing farmland and all that. He destroyed the industrial sector. He destroyed the agriculture. 30 to 40 million Chinese are believed to have starved to death. Mao wanted a distraction. And what was the distraction? It was the India. And that's when he kind of moved in. They planned this very well in 1962. They struck at the precise moment that the United States, which is this other actor in this grand theater, was distracted with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That precise month in October, right? Almost 2 weeks in October.
A few days even overlapped, I think.
It was actually overlapped. I mean, that's when they chose to launch their offensive. And here you have the United States, which is this other significant partner of India, both the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in conflict, trying to prevent nuclear war. And Mao took the opportunity to launch this swift border aggression. So the waves of the Chinese troops, and they were all very prepared. They had upwards of 4 divisions, right, on the Tibetan plateau. We barely had 1 division, right? That is how thinly guarded it was. But the run-up to this thing was that they had the government of India launched something called the forward policy, which is to assert our sovereignty on the line that we believed. We launched these little penny packets of men, small companies, platoons, and all along the border with China, with all along the boundary with China. And when China struck, this is on the 18th of November, is the second phase of the Chinese offensive. You had Rezangla, which is this very important hill feature overlooking the Spangur Gap, and you have the Chushul airfield there, right? It's really important for the Indian Army to hold that, because if they let go of that vantage point, the Chinese would walk in and grab the Chushul airfield, and the whole defense of that entire Chushul area would collapse, and they could literally march into Leh and capture that whole region. So it was really important that they held their ground there. And this is when you have the men of Major Shaitan Singh's company, the Kumaonis, who hold their ground over there. And literally in a span of, the battle lasted about 10 hours or something like that. But it is outstanding in the grit and determination that our soldiers displayed, that they literally, as you mentioned, they died fighting to the last man, last round, out of a company. A company is about 120, 130 men. An infantry battalion is made up of 3 companies, sometimes more. They were part of a battalion. That one company of 120 men, each company is commanded by a major. Literally 116 of them died. They were, our story is that the Chinese attacked in very large numbers. And that is true of mountain warfare, where the ratio of defenders to the offensive is sometimes 1:10, 1:20 even. The Chinese attacked in very large numbers. It was a brigade plus that attacked this small little defensive line of about 3 to 4 kilometers. The company was strung out along these 3 to 4 kilometers. And over 10 to 12 hours, they struck late in the night. And by early morning, they had overrun this company. Now, the thing is that they did not retreat. Now, there are other parts in the northeast, for instance, battles where there have been retreats of the Indian Army for tactical reasons. And, brigades had collapsed, they had been captured and all that. But here in Ladakh, the defense was ferocious. I mean, it was so tenacious, the kind of defense. Like literally this kind of thing we've never seen in any Indian conflict post-1947. We've seen that in Saragari, but the battle in the 19th century. But here again, they held their positions, last man, last round. They literally died fighting, and they were faced with tremendous odds. I mean, the army got into this absolutely stupid forward policy, right? They committed soldiers on the ground. They had no equipment. They had no heavy artillery. They didn't have machine guns. They had bolt action rifles, all of those things. And they never actually anticipated the Chinese would actually do what they did during the border war in October. Now, when you don't believe your adversary is capable of launching an offensive, your fundamentals are flawed. And when your fundamentals are flawed, it leads to a very severe military defeat, which is what happened in 62. So the men of this company, Major Shaitan Singh's company, were just completely overrun. But it remains the greatest last stand made by Indian Army since 1947. It's an outstanding act of bravery that these men, they've literally fought because they knew that if they failed, if they did not hold their line, the Chinese would roll over and they would capture everything, all the territory at the rear. So that's what. And this is a story, interestingly, that came to light much later.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Only in early 1963, that in the melee of what happened, the army was, still picking up the pieces. What happened when the Chinese retreated? That is when early 1963, I believe around December, Jan, when they went to those positions and they found that, soldiers had literally died fighting over there. They had lost contact with this company. And what the survivors then told them, they literally didn't believe the initial, that is one version of the story, that they didn't believe what the survivors, the 4-odd or the 6-odd survivors who told this thing that, they had been sent away by the company. Some of them came back, walking back to our lines, and that they narrated this, heroic story of sacrifice, bravery, which is captured in that movie Hakikat. And so Major Shaitan Singh's bravery is legend. I mean, this is the stuff that the Indian Army literally worships. And those lines that you mentioned, that you just read out, it's there on that Rezangla memorial. 18th of November every year, Rezangla Day.
Yeah. That poem actually talks about a Roman commander who stands literally at the gates of his city, preventing the enemy from entering. That's exactly what happened in this case. So then, zooming out, Sandeep, now to the larger war, we'll obviously talk about the two aspects that lead to a conflict between India and China. One, that McMahon line, infamous McMahon line, and second, in this case, the so-called Nehru's blunder. We'll come to that, obviously. But for now, I want to talk about just at the tactical level, those days of the war. The 1962 war, from its start to its end, what happened in those two sectors, the sectors that are now known as the Western Front and the Eastern Front, which, by the way, for many people is a bit odd, because when you look at the map of India, it seems odd, कि वहाँ पे West कैसे हो सकता है? But then, if you face yourself towards China, that's when you'll realize Western is just the left of you, Eastern is just the right of you. So the right back then was the Northeast Frontier Agency, Arunachal Pradesh, basically. The left was Ladakh, like you were describing. So China launched an offensive. Tell us what happened over the many days, and why is this war seen, and it is, a failure for the Indian Army?
Well, I gave you the build-up to that conflict. What happened really when we grossly underestimated Mao Zedong, right? We didn't read him right. And Prime Minister Nehru, this is a good man, but he had no combat experience. He didn't understand where people came from, what shaped them as leaders. Mao Zedong is a guy who's been fighting all his life, right? He was in the hills, in the caves. He literally launched the Chinese Communist Party in the 20s, and then he captured that country in 1949. Wily guy, right? He waited for Chiang Kai-shek to wear himself out fighting the Japanese. And once the Japanese had been defeated, he just marched and took over the whole country, right? So the Chinese Communist Party is a very wily party, and that's the reason they're still in power over there. And when he saw China, when Mao saw Nehru, he saw him as a bit of a simpleton who didn't understand the complexities of waging war, or who understood imperial geography and all of those things. You can argue that Nehru probably didn't even have the exposure to conflict, combat, didn't know anything about the military, for instance, right? We are supposed to have won our freedom through non-violent means, right? And that is a big a fundamental DNA problem, that when you say that you've acquired your independence through non-violent means, then you're not able to use violence to defend yourselves, right? And so the 1962 war was, we literally plunged headlong into this conflict with the Chinese. We didn't read them right. We didn't prepare for this, despite the fact that you had military exercises like Lal Killa that was done. There was an exercise called Lal Killa, which actually said that, look, the Chinese could attack us and this is what we need to do to defend ourselves. Sardar Patel, the late Home Minister, before one of his last messages to Pandit Nehru was that we've never had a border with the Chinese. They are now on our border. Do not trust them, right? So you had plenty of warning of the fact that the Chinese did not mean us any good, right? They were implacable enemies. But Prime Minister Nehru, he chose the path of Panchsheel and the mutual coexistence and two Asian civilizational nations coming together against imperialism, all of that. So he made all those fundamental mistakes. And then when China invaded and they launched their divisions into us, he was in a state of shock, because it's like this building that you've created. Overnight, you see that building collapsing, literally. It's very tragic, and he passed away just 2 years after the war. In 1964, he had died. And one of the reasons for that, he was literally a broken man after this conflict. And when you made that initial misconception of the Chinese, You got in the wrong people. He got one of his relatives there, this Lieutenant General B.M. Call, who had never faced any action during the Second World War. He appointed all the wrong people. General Thimaiya had recommended SPP Thorat be made chief. He overruled his recommendation. Thorat was an aggressive soldier, general. He chose somebody else, General Thapar, who was more pliable, part of the extended family and all that. So, when you see political interference in the military, this was the most glaring aspect of that,
right.
because it kind of manifested itself in defeat. And the worst part about it is, this is horrifying, because in 1962, India had a very strong air force. We may not have had...
Bring that up.
Yeah. We may not have had a very strong military on the ground that was capable, kitted out, equipped to fight a high altitude campaign. You're talking of going from 15 feet to 15,000 feet, right? That is the altitudes at which the Indian Army was fighting. I mean, it is a Himalayan, it's been called a Himalayan blunder, but it's a Himalayan battle that they fought. You're literally going from the plains, you're going up to the mountains, and you're fighting an army that's pouring across the plateau. They're sitting on the plateau, they have the high ground, and they just have to extend their lines a few hundred kilometers to resupply their troops. Whereas for us, it's literally an uphill task. You're climbing up, you're ascending, and then you're fighting on those valleys. But at that time, we had 18 fighter squadrons. The Indian Air Force was one of the best air forces in Asia. May not be in the world, but in Asia, it was a fantastic air force. You had Hawker Hunters, you had Uragans, you had bombers, you had Canberras, you had state-of-the-art aircraft, right? And they were not allowed to enter the fray. They were kept out of the war.
Why?
Because the political leadership, Prime Minister Nehru was advised, and he took that decision that if we deployed the Air Force in an offensive role, the Chinese would retaliate by bombing our cities, Kolkata, right? Kolkata would be bombed. The Chief Minister of Kolkata, Bengal, said, oh no, my state will be bombed by the Chinese. The Intelligence Bureau, you had Bholanath Malik, who was the IB chief for decades. The IB was in charge of external intelligence, by the way.
Yes.
So the RNAW was set up much later, 6
Yeah.
years after this disastrous war. They gave all kinds of stupid assessments to the political leadership that, we can't deploy the Air Force because if we deploy it, the Chinese will deploy their Air Force, they'll deploy their bombers. Despite having all the intel that the Indian Air Force was literally raring to go. And here is something that I picked up in during the Kargil War. I remember I was in Bombay at that time. Air Marshal Tipnis had come down to brief us there. And in the press conference, he said, this was after the Air Force had been deployed in Safed Sagar in Kargil. And he turned to me and he said that, I was a young pilot sitting in the cockpit of a Hunter aircraft. I was fully armed. My tank was full. My cannons were loaded. We had rockets. And we were sitting in the cockpit literally and waiting for the order to be given so we could take off and attack the Chinese. And he says that order never came. And it was such a demoralizing incident for the Indian Air Force that despite having all of these, state-of-the-art fighter aircraft, fighter bombers, they were never deployed in combat. And this is this is something that comes out of talking to air power experts like Air Marshal Deeptendu Chaudhary. And this is that, there's a fundamental mismatch in the way the political leadership has seen air power. Air power, by definition, is a very offensive arm of military power. Whereas when you say that we are only meant for defense, the armed forces of India, if you put it in your mind that, they only meant for defense, you will never think of using air power, right? So this is something that, in hindsight, hindsight is, perfect vision, I know. But if the political leadership had decided to unleash the Indian Air Force, they could have retrieved the 1962 war. I still believe that despite all our reverses, despite the sacrifices of, brave soldiers like Major Shaitan Singh, literally last man, last round, the Indian Air Force, if it had come into the conflict, even as late as November, they could have retrieved the situation. They could have attacked the Chinese because, guess what? Of course, the Prime Minister was being advised by all these wise experts, the the US ambassador to India advised him against that, believe it or not. John Kenneth Galbraith was US ambassador, and he said, oh no, you shouldn't deploy the Air Force because the Chinese will attack. The IB, of course, told him that. The political, ground, leadership, they also advised against this. And here you're wondering that why did the Prime Minister take advice from all of these guys who don't mean the country well? And here's the thing. There was intelligence then to suggest there was a Chinese pilot who had defected with a MiG-17 or a MiG-19 to Taiwan, right, in the late 50s, early 60s. And he had told the interrogators, the Western interrogators, we were incidentally given access to this briefing, where he said that the Chinese Air Force on the plateau doesn't have enough fuel to fly or fight. So this whole thing of thousands of bombers coming and hitting India was non-existent. There were no aircraft. They were not in any shape to fight or fly, because guess what? A few years before that, the Chinese had broken up with the Soviets. Right? Yeah. Khrushchev had thrown the Chinese out, and they had fought a border war after that in '69. So the ties were really at an all-time low. Their entire fighter fleet was of Russian origin. They needed Russian experts, they needed Russian technicians, they needed fuel, all of those things they didn't have. All they had was a very strong military. We had a military that was strong but not adequate in numbers. They were throwing divisions at us, and we were replying with what? Not even brigades. A brigade is a 3,000 strong military force. A division is like 15,000 strong, right? And you have, positions like this defended by companies, platoons. That's how we were fighting. I mean, it's heartbreaking when you read these accounts. But you had the Air Force, chose not to use it. And guess what happened?
Yeah. So then the other question and the other mystery is, at what point did China, which was in an advantageous position, decide that's it and chose to basically stop the war and retreat? If it was like you're describing such a bad show, such a poor show by the military, what stopped them from literally invading the entire Northeast, from literally invading the entire of Ladakh?
Good question, Dev. And you ask your friends from the Northeast, especially in Assam, and they've never forgiven the political leadership for what they said in November of 1962, when the Prime Minister is supposed to have said, my heart goes out to the people of Assam, right? Part of a speech where we believed that the whole Northeast had been lost. And, as far as Tezpur, that's on the plains in Assam, they had just vacated the whole place. They had emptied out the treasury, they had opened up the jails, the asylums, and there are some very haunting reports by B.G. Varghese, who was a reporter at that time, walking through, Tezpur and describing the situation. It's a ghost town. India actually believed that the whole of the Northeast was going to collapse.
Wow.
Right? There was nothing stopping the Chinese. Now, it's a good question. Why did the Chinese pull back? Somewhere on the 20th of November, they seem to have decided that we need, enough is enough, and we are now withdrawing back to our claim lines. So they climbed all the way back. They left all the positions that they had captured. They even returned a lot of the equipment that they had, captured from us. Unusual. It's there in some of their propaganda videos. I mean, that is basically meant to, put out the Chinese Communist Party's view of things. But here is the thing. They didn't do it out of any magnanimity. Now it's November, right? Towards the end of November, snow is falling. And Chairman Mao knows, as anyone else, that you cannot maintain those logistical lines for very long. So, under the pretext of this magnanimity, there was actually a lot of military thinking that went in, where they said that, look, we can't maintain these positions. There is a possibility that the Indians could hit us back with American support, so they withdrew very quietly. They went back to their claim lines. In Ladakh, of course, they did pull back. And where they're standing today is literally where they were in 1962 in November. And we have lost in Ladakh an area the size of the state of Kerala, my state. 38,000 square kilometers is lost. And this is what we're negotiating, Aksai Chin, the entire area of Aksai Chin. Which is what, we have the maps, we have the evidence to suggest that all of this were treaties that were negotiated as way back as the 17th century between Indian rulers in Ladakh and the Tibetan rulers. And of course, this was formalized by the British in the early 20th. Now, the Chinese don't recognize any of that. They call it, colonial. And all that. So, I mean, you leave everything to the Chinese, they will find the evidence to suggest that even India at some point, this hypothetical, was a vassal state of the Chinese. Therefore, India, everything under the sun in India belongs to us. The Chinese have a way of doing things and manipulating history and manipulating geography and cartographic aggression. You have to learn it from the Chinese. That's how they do it.
Yeah, this is akin to taking 4 steps forward and then taking 2 steps back and saying, we are drawing. But you're forgetting that they've taken two steps forward by the end of it, right?
Right.
That's net. Right. We'll talk more about this, but after a quick break.
People want SUVs.
Correct.
So let's first talk about the existing players in the market and what they're doing in the Indian EV segment for SUVs.
Yeah.
Which do you think is the first name which comes into your mind which is doing something ravishing?
So, my mind, the Mahindra definitely tops the list, but I think most people will disagree. Most people will think of the Hyundai Creta Electric, which shares a very similar approach in terms of philosophy to the car that we are about to talk about today. The Mahindra, though, represents something radical, and that's why it catches my fancy. And I think a lot of people in my age group would agree, as in to say not older people, such as...
I like the BE6 quite a lot.
Yeah?
Straight up.
Yeah.
Because I'll tell you why.
But would you buy one?
Yes, I would.
Rubbish.
BE6 I would.
Rubbish.
Because
You're
of the
such an
simple
old
fact.
person. You came back and you were like, I want the Scorpio because it's soft, it's comfortable, and it can go fast, without old people in my car realizing that it can go fast.
Isn't that a fantastic thing? I mean, you're
yeah,
sitting
but
at...
you are going to buy the BE6, nah. Buy the BE6. No.
Yeah, BE6 is going to be a very different purchase.
Welcome back. Sandeep, before the break, you were talking about the 62 war, how it panned out, how it basically resulted in a loss for the Indian army, and you had the Chinese withdrawing.
Yeah.
A thought that's always struck me is that in the years after, in the months after, was there never any thought given, discussions held within the government, within the military, to sort of take revenge? Because there's one thing about militaries that we know, that we keep talking about on this podcast, is that they swear by the philosophy of an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
So if someone attacks you, if someone takes your territory, if someone punches you, you punch back, you take back the territory, you also attack them. So, okay, in November, you've lost the fighting, you've lost the war, the winter is coming, like you said. In those months, there probably would have been time to recoup, resupply, get your troops from the plains, maybe rethink the idea of using your air force for some coercive bombing.
Right.
Was that ever a question in the minds of, or a point of discussion within, from what you've read?
Well, I know for a fact that there were very, very detailed Air Force planning that would gone into these offensive missions, right down to the number of sorties that they would generate and the weapons that they would use, cannons, rockets, bombs, all of that. They was all planned. It was all there. The political leadership, of course, like I said, repeatedly rejected these things. No, we are never going to use the Air Force in an offensive role. So not one bomb was dropped, not one rocket was fired, not one cannon was fired, right, through the whole conflict. It's a shameful, state of things that played out in 1962. But, this other point you mentioned, they very interesting. Now, what happened actually as a result of that defeat is that the whole system went into shock.
Okay.
And you had this myth of the 12-foot tall Chinaman being created. And that is something that is held firm even till date, if you look at it, right up to Ladakh. Probably at I'm talking of the 2020 Ladakh standoff, where you had the Galwan skirmish. Incidentally, there's a movie being made about that as well.
Yes.
Being
Salman
shot.
Khan.
Salman Khan's thing that's out early next year. So probably the first time in cinema history that you're seeing 2 movies on the China war, several decades apart, being made within, released within months of each other. Interesting. Yeah. And by the way, there's a third movie also out on the other front. So there's two fronts. There's a Dhurandhar movie
Yes,
that's in
that's coming.
Pakistan.
That's coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So it's
coming
all
later this month.
geopolitical movies are the flavor of the season, it seems. But, coming back to the point is that when you're defeated in the mind, I think you become very defensive. But at the same time, this fear of China kind of went into the system. So let's not provoke the Chinese. Another 62 might happen. That kind of got called out for the first time in 67 when you saw the clashes in Sundarongchu, where for the first time the Indian military stood up and they replied to the Chinese. And they kind of backed off.
Yes.
You had in 87 to General Sundarji airlifted an entire brigade in Arunachal. There was a standoff with the Chinese which lasted almost a decade, several years after that, in fact. And in 2020, when India rapidly militarized, I was on the ground there covering this build-up, and I saw the first things that India had deployed there was the Indian Air Force, fighter jets landing in Leh. And I there was a sense of relief for me that I said, if there's ever going to be a war, this was sometime in about June or July, if there's ever going to be a war, God forbid, nobody wants these kind of things to happen. The Indian Air Force is not going to be left out this time, right? So the defeat in the mind actually led to a kind of a defensive mentality. But at the same time, the Indian state in post-1962 carried out one of the most significant reforms of the defense ministry in terms of expanding the military budget. The military budget literally went through the roof. It crossed 3% of the GDP. It was less than 2% at that time. It crossed 3%. And they started raising mountain divisions, formations. Literally, the Indian military grew. It became double or triple the size. And what you see today is a result of that post-1962 buildup of soldiers. Literally double, triple in size. And Pakistan saw that happening. And they realized, Field Marshal Ayub realized that the only chance he had to grab Kashmir was 65. They were held to a standstill. And in 71, you saw that utter defeat where East Pakistan was broken away, became an independent nation. And I argue, I wouldn't be wrong on this, 1971 would not have happened but for 1962. Because that shock to the system was so intense that we started putting in a lot of things in process. We expanded, we gave serious thought to, we started giving a lot of attention to battle-hardened military leadership like General Harbaksh, Field Marshal Manekshaw. All of these personalities came out after the defeat of 62. Whereas you had that whole coterie of generals that led us, that, literally sleepwalked into disaster in 62. They were completely marginalized. They were faded away into history. But you had a very new crop of aggressive young leaders who had found favor, and they rose through the ranks. Thank God for that. So, and also some very serious capability building was done. There was an organization called the DGS, Directorate General Security, which was set up, shortly after the war in 62, which was 3 arms. This is actually our first big covert warfighting force. It was under the Intelligence Bureau to begin with. It had 3 arms. It had the Special Frontier Force, which was literally you can call it the Dalai Lama's army. The Special Services Bureau, meant to train local populations in resistance fighting, something that was learnt in Europe during the Nazi occupation. And you had the third one, which was the Aviation Research Center.
Yes.
3 very key organizations, and under this overall DGS that was set up, this organization continues. It's now under the RNAW. And of course, in 68, you had the RNAW being set up as a dedicated external intelligence agency. So they said that, look, you can't have your intelligence agency doing everything, internal and external intelligence, which is what the IB was doing. So they weren't giving very clear intel to the government. And a lot of capabilities, gaps were there. Those were filled up. And that's why you saw a very different account of us presenting ourselves in 71. And of course, that continued. This paralysis when it came to China, it continued, that no border infrastructure till the early 21st century, when we actually saw the Chinese building up big time on the Tibetan plateau, when they there was an explosive burst of infrastructure building. You had that high altitude railway line that came over there, and that's when India realized, look, if we don't match their infrastructure build, you're going to see another 62 kind of situation, and this time they probably won't go back.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the building up that you're seeing now with the Border Roads Organization and all that is a response to what the Chinese have been doing in the 21st century. But the main thing is that it's really important to first fight the Chinese in the mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're very good at mind games. And our defensive mentality, I think that is going to take a while to get out of, needs to be complemented with an offensive mindset as well.
Yeah, but I think you've already seen some bits and pieces of that during the recent 4-year standoff with the Chinese, when you had at the tactical level at least,
Yes.
the Indian Army taking some offensive action, putting on some offensive missions when they thought the need was there for such missions. Right, Sandeep, a quick tangent on this infamous McMahon line, to sort of understand why this problem even exists between India and China. Is it as simple as what I've read, that the core problem is that the line was drawn on a small map with a pen? The stroke of that pen on that map looks thin to you, but on the ground it could be vast. The width could be as many kilometers, which is why you have China claiming until point A, while India claims until point B, and you have both those points overlapping. And also the fact that the text of that agreement, when it was signed by the British. By the way, British, everything in this world, I think today, modern problems all goes back to the British.
Empires, blame it on the British.
Yeah. So when the treaty was signed, when the Tibet was still not under Chinese occupation, there was some text about how that sort of line runs naturally towards the north, and something about watershed, but then that did not really match what was happening on the ground in terms of the geography of how the rivers flowed. So is it as simple as that, or is it more to it?
Actually, there's more to it. It's a fact. See, the British have made a hash of things wherever they've gone, right, across the world. That's one of the legacies of the British Empire. We have to just live with it. But the fact is that if you look at the larger picture, the bigger picture is that China is not interested in a border or a boundary settlement with India.
Okay.
If you look at the Great Game, people say that the Great Game ended when the British left in 1947 and 48. And possibly one of the last acts of the Great Game was the transfer of Gilgit-Baltistan to Pakistan, to ensure that India and the Soviet Union never had a land boundary. But I argue that the Great Game still continues. The players have changed a bit. The Chinese have now entered the Great Game. The Americans want to come back in. The Chinese do not want a settlement of the boundary with India because that reduces a lot of pressure on the Indian military. Chinese are one of the founders of acupressure and acupuncture. And this is something that they would like to do all along this boundary with India. The Chinese regard India as a near-peer competitor in Asia. And throughout their last 60, 70 years, their effort has been to ensure that India is corralled in the Indian subcontinent, what people call the South Asia, right? So they have propped up Pakistan as a counter to India in South Asia. They've propped up North Korea as a counter to South Korea and to Japan in East Asia. Now, if they were to settle the boundary with India, along whatever alignment is mutually agreed to by both the countries, that would free up a lot of military resources, right? Where you're not deployed all along the LAC like India has been since 2020. And we still don't know. More than 5.5 years later, we still don't know why the Chinese did what they did in 2020. But you just have to go into the mind of Xi Jinping to understand this, right? And you possibly start to get answers. And whoever I've asked in the Indian leadership, definitely the Chief of Defense Staff, the late CDS General Rawat, he mentioned that this operation in 2020 in Ladakh was directly, it came down from the political leadership in China, right? It was Xi Jinping. It goes all the way up there. Nothing in China happens by accident. So this whole thing was a means of keeping India in check, under control, under a lot of pressure. There were talks about, you take, Ladakh, you allow us to keep Aksai Chin and we will allow you to keep Arunachal Pradesh. That swap was suggested by Chow En-lai in the 50s, 60s. But then that's gone off into the background now. But now, the entire India-China boundary dispute has become a kind of a military race for power and supremacy. If China will not want to settle this right now, because it would, like I said, allow India to focus on building up the military or reduce the pressure on the border, which will free up resources to maybe tackle Pakistan. Those are those things.
Yeah.
So they would want that pressure on India to remain, which is why you see the kind of collusivity between India and China all through, you saw it through Operation Sindoor. And even before that, that's where it's headed. But the fact is that, yes, the British did err in a lot of places. Historically, they have. That thick line is a fact. There are portions because of the thickness of the pencil which are, overlapping. But if your mindset does not allow you to settle the border favorably, then it doesn't matter. Those alignments really don't matter. Then all that you will be faced with is an adversary who will keep doing what we call salami slicing tactics, right? 4 steps forward, 2 steps back. And he's created a so-called buffer zone, and he's pressurizing you on the buffer zone. Incidentally, the place where Major Shaitan Singh and his men made their last stand falls in the buffer zone.
Okay.
So we briefly had access to that 5 years back when we launched that operation on the Kailash range to capture all those areas that were in the buffer zone. But as part of the post-conflict pullback, we kind of moved back, and that's now once again back in the buffer zone. All those areas, the Sangars where they made their last stand, some of the graves are there. All of those places are still in the buffer. This is what China's grand strategy is. They're not looking at any great border settlement with India. In fact, the only 2 countries they've not settled their borders with are India and, of course, Bhutan, which they're pressurizing. So this is possibly going to become worse in the years. If we don't stand up to the Chinese, we're going to have, a hard time ahead. I don't foresee a very happy situation in the next couple of years. If they were to settle that, it would be the most logical thing to do. They would not have to deploy on these, and the 62 war, what we forget, Dave, is that it's the first time in history that 2 nations had fought at this altitude in division strength. And the post-2020 deployment as well. Never in history have such large formations. Like, you're not talking of literally divisions or corps, but entire field armies are deployed at such altitudes, like more than 100,000, 150,000 men deployed on this altitude. Never happened before. It's the logical thing to do. Demilitarize that entire area, go down to a settlement, start the boundary level talks. The special representatives are talking, ours and theirs. But when you have incidents like Ladakh, your Galwan clash and all that takes the whole process back by decades. So your entire negotiations on the McMahon line and all that have literally, taken a beating. Now, for us, the biggest casualty, and we've discussed this in past episodes, is the loss of trust. You can't trust the Chinese. They continuously been building up their side of the border. They've been creating those border villages, which point to very gloomy signs for the future, where they've looked at the treaty clauses which say that populated areas cannot be exchanged, right? So they're foreclosing any such possibility of any. So I think the boundary lines, whichever way you look at it, whether it's the McMahon line, whether it's the LAC, the way we look at it, the way they look at it, this is going to continue for the next 10, 20 years until possibly a new generation of politicians come either in India or in China or in both places, and then decide, look, it's only in our best interest to settle this. Right now, it doesn't seem to be the case, given the kind of leadership that you have in China that's antagonistic to you.
Final thought on the 62 war. We've spent this entire episode talking about how we see it from the Indian perspective. But I'm very interested to know, how does China see the 62 war? Whether it's in its literature, whether it's in its writing, the analysts that China has across in several think tanks across the world, what they sort of propagate when they talk about the 62 war in terms of why they launched, even if they accept that they launched an offensive. So what have you read about this? What do you know about this? What can you tell us about how China sees the 62 war?
Well, a good question, Dev. The Chinese, how they see this is, it is framed in their official lingo as the Sino-Indian border self-defensive offensive war, something like that.
Wow.
It's quite a mouthful, but they're saying that it was a war that they had to strike in self-defense.
Right.
That's what the title suggests in Chinese. It hasn't occupied much mind space for the Chinese thing. They look at the Korean War as this heroic struggle against the West and all of that, and it was a brutal war. But 62 is a footnote. It rarely exists. It barely exists. And I kind of see why, because of that great leap forward. When you've lost 30 million of your citizens, then a small boundary war in which the casualties are as follows. The Indian casualties, about 4,000 soldiers were killed and 4,000 were captured, around 4,000. There's several thousands more injured. The Chinese, and this is the thing that you have to take with a pinch of salt, they claim to have lost only about 700 soldiers and 1,000 injured. The official figures would probably be much more. And in Rezangla, incidentally, India's, the company, the Ahir company that was of Kumaunis that were literally last man, last round, they're supposed to have inflicted heavy casualties on the Chinese. More than 1,000 is what we say. Because they literally kept firing bullets until there were no bullets to fire. The Chinese state never accepts casualties very easily. So even in this framing of this war as a self-defensive, offensive action that they undertook, they haven't come out with what many people believe the actual accurate estimate of casualties. So it's a minor footnote in their whole overall military history thing, and it's not given too much of importance. But politically, for Mao, it is really important to teach India a lesson. And Mao was out of control in 62, as I mentioned. He was this mad, angry, savage, paranoid dictator who did the most horrible things to his people. And guess who he threw into a gulag or a camp and brutalized and beat up? Xi Jinping's parents. They were hardcore. They were literally the people that Xi Jinping that Mao began his struggle with. So Xi Jinping's father was condemned. He was banished to the countryside. His wife was forced to condemn her son, young Xi. So there's an interesting study of how this enigma that Xi Jinping has become today is a result of all the childhood trauma that he's supposed to have suffered during the Cultural Revolution and all of that. But 62, minor footnote for the Chinese, no movies made. There was exactly that one movie. It's a propaganda movie that came out a couple of years back. It was released on the 50th anniversary of the India-China war. It's still there on YouTube. I think it's a half-hour, 45-minute thing. But no popular culture, no movies in popular culture. All their attention of the Chinese film industry is reserved for what the Japanese did to them and what the Americans did to them in Korea. So I think we seem to have gotten away with just that minor propaganda movie in the 60s.
Yeah, right. Interesting. I think we'll end it there. One final quick question, talking about movies. So movies happening on this, the Battle of Rezang. Movie had already happened on this, by the way.
Yeah.
Fresh one is happening now. Like you said, a movie on Galwan is happening. What's that one battle across all the wars that India has fought you think deserves a movie that still hasn't been made?
A movie that, apart from mine on the Operation X, subtle book plug
Oh,
here, guys.
yes, actually.
that of course. But one I would like to see is, and I believe he's already making a movie on it. That is, Farhan Akhtar is planning something on the 1971 missile attack on Karachi. That's a
one we talked about last time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is possibly under under production. But more than just the battles, there are plenty of battles that we can focus on. There are also stories that need to be told, Dave, on operations like the Indian Army's move into Bangladesh, for instance,
Yes.
the liberation of Bangladesh. It was one of the most glorious chapters in the 20th century, where you had one army entering this province in support of a genocide, the people who were, being massacred by an occupational army of the Pakistani army, liberating that province, making a new country of Bangladesh, and then rapidly withdrawing.
Yeah.
And allowing that country to flourish and thrive for more than half a century. That story has never been told.
True.
That how India created Bangladesh or helped create Bangladesh in just 9 months, starting from Operation Searchlight in March 1971, right up to the creation of Bangladesh in December 16th, 1971, and a country that was literally, literally living on a hand-to-mouth existence.
Yeah.
It was a very poor country, but it had a very focused politico-military leadership that thought that this was the right thing to do. And there are so many other smaller stories as part of this larger story that can be told about how there was a very brave Pakistani journalist who saw the massacre, and he wrote that big, very haunting story, Antony Mascarenhas, Genocide in 71. All of those, I think we've still not, done justice to the sacrifice that we made. Very unusual, but a very interesting kind of thing that only India could do. We always, when you look at world history, how the Allies liberated France and Europe from the Nazis and all that. We never look at this one great example of how India liberated this province there, where there was actually a genocide on. So that's a story. Anyone watching it, get any ideas? Please make a story on the 1971 liberation of Bangladesh. It's one of the greatest stories of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, actually. I think perhaps we should do a couple of episodes on that, in fact, because like you said, it's sort of that perfect operation, right? It's not just as simple as you just sending your army across and, you know, it coming back with victory. It's also operations like the one you've written about. The sort of base you prepared before that offensive that you launched, physical offensive that you launched, that overt offensive, the covert base that you prepared, whether it was by funding the Mukti Bahini, whether it was through the naval covert ops that not many knew about until your book came out. So that sort of, you're right. It's a perfect operation that I think deserves a movie. And
a politico-military kind of thing. And, exactly like how possibly like the Cuban Missile Crisis could be even an OTT series, because I think that far too many chapters of this for one movie to do justice to.
It's a fantastic point. So if anyone's listening, any director is listening to us out there, perhaps they can take some cues from there. Okay, that's it, Sandeep. Great chat as always. Fantastic discussion. Loved all the insights that you had on this
Thanks,
history
Dave.
episode.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. And thanks as always to our listeners and viewers. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries without a passport. Bye-bye.